Hello, welcome to the New Stack Makers, a podcast where we talk about at-scale application development, deployment, and management. Modern businesses depend on the power of real-time data. With Redis Labs, organizations deliver instant experiences in a highly reliable and scalable manner. Redis Labs is the home of Redis, the world's most popular in-memory database and commercial provider of Redis Enterprise. Hey, it's Alex Williams of the New Stack, and here at AWS reInvent, perhaps the biggest cloud conference of the year. Arguably, I can't think there is a bigger cloud conference in the world. I think there's, I don't know, how many people here? 50,000, whatever.
60,000.
60,000.
Over 60,000.
Man. And it's one of those people is Bruce Gain. Hey, Bruce.
Yeah, hey, thanks for inviting me here.
Bruce is one of our correspondents. He's actually based in France, but he came over here. He's been over here, I think, almost 2 weeks. You were in Utah and stayed with us in Oregon, and here you are.
Getting over jet lag and being overwhelmed.
Also joining us for our conversation is Alvin Richards, Chief Product Officer at Redis Labs.
Good afternoon, good morning, wherever time zone we're in at the moment.
Yeah, you could check your watch, I guess. You could do that.
Yeah, it still tells me I'm at some time.
Alvin was telling us he actually has a watch, and he finds he checks his phone less often.
Yeah. It's amazing.
It is amazing. And Rajat Panwar, a CTO at Holidayme. How are you?
All good, and thank you for inviting me. I guess it's good evening, based on my watch.
Yeah. So how many reInvents is this for each year?
So for me, this is the third one.
Okay.
This is number 2 or number 3.
Okay. Yeah. Good. Well, I want to talk about databases. What else would we talk about with Redis Labs if it wasn't about databases?
We love databases.
I get that.
You know, we are the most loved database on AWS.
You are the most loved database on it. Like, there's a big heart there for Redis Labs.
Yeah,
absolutely.
That's a lot of love. You know, actually, I remember when Redis Labs was first starting, and I was talking to one of the founders. It was 7 years ago, 8 years ago. I don't know. I can't even remember now. But they were like, it's going like crazy. It's going like crazy. I guess it still is.
Absolutely. I mean, Redis as an open source project we just had our 11th anniversary. And as an open source project, it's been super popular with developers, billions of downloads on Docker Hub, most loved, database in Stack Exchange, 3 years running, the most deployed database on AWS. So by all of those metrics, it's amazing. Redis Labs and the Redis Enterprise product has been going amazingly well as well. For me, the thing is the rate at which large enterprises are making very big bets and investments on these new technologies and quickly adopting them to allow them to dramatically change their business processes, how quickly they can go to market, and the innovation that they can actually provide their customers. And it's really quite remarkable what's been happening in the last few years.
Okay, so I just want to set a framework, and then I'm going to ask Bruce to ask a question. So, Redis is loved. It's an established presence in the community. You call it an open source database. What do you think about open source these days? You guys have talked a lot about your version of what you think open source is, and I want to just set that as a context just so we can get started there and just help define that from your perspective. How do you view open source?
I think open source has been morphing, evolving over the last 15, 20 years. If you think about the first big open source project, it really was Linux. And, as that project developed and vendors came in to want to offer services around that, it caused the licensing models to evolve and change. I think, as we've seen in the last few years, companies have had to rethink what open source really means in the context of of cloud services. So who should be able to monetize, who should be able to evolve and direct what that product is and where it should go. All of the companies in this space have been evolving their thinking as the market has changed. And I think we have this conversation in 5 years' time and look back, we'll see that the world is going to significantly change in the next 5 years as well. So I think it's sort of unsettled at the moment. And I think the position that many companies like ourselves and other database and NoSQL vendors out there has also changed because of the ever-changing tides.
How does that affect you? And then Bruce, I'll let you go. How does that affect like an end user like yourself? Is there any change, any subtle changes you notice that have an influence on your decision making?
First thing, what comes to mind whenever you talk about open sources, like it's free, right? So, and that used to be the case like even till recently. But going forward in terms of basically how the things they are changing in terms of the support and the kind of additional services which are being provided. So practically the complete meaning is changing, and you are having additional, I would say, services or features which are getting restricted from a cloud, all these cloud providers put together. So I would say like open source is having, or its meaning is completely changing, and probably next 2 years we'll be able to understand basically how that is having an impact altogether.
How do you see the service model evolving and changing in support of an open source databases, for example?
Well, I look at statements people like Gartner are making, which is their magic quadrant for database is going to exclude on-premise deployments going forward. Right?
When did they say that?
That was recently in the last couple of months.
Really?
And so what that really says is agencies or organizations like Gartner are going to say, if it's not running in the cloud, then we're not interested in measuring it. Uh-huh. And so that's not just people running themselves in the cloud, that's the services around, in our case, databases that are being run. So sure. I think there is a very big sea change. Now, are things going to happen as quickly as everyone expects? You know, people are adopting technology at a super fast rate, but they've also got huge investments in Oracle and DB2 on big mainframes that aren't going to go away quickly. So I think the key thing is whatever you've got in terms of a cloud service, you have to have a hybrid. You have to allow people to run things on-prem, in the cloud, maybe across clouds. And you have to have technologies that can adopt or adapt to all of those deployment models. It's not one and done. It's like I've got to be in different places.
Yeah. So the change which I see, like in terms of basically why and the open source. So earlier, how it was like, you can deploy any open source on physical machine, or you are doing that deployment yourself, right? But since all these cloud providers, they have come into picture, so they are doing the heavy lifting, and whatever the enterprise support that you used to take from all these open source companies, so that has been taken care by all these cloud providers. Now, definitely the question which comes across is, like, now this enterprise thing which these open source companies, they were able to provide, since that has been taken over by the cloud providers, so they have to look for a different pricing model. So that's why this complete shift is coming across, right? So for instance, let's say, even if we see with the new databases, I won't take their names, but this is a normal trend which is happening. And past 1 year, this has changed drastically.
So when you think about that, how's it affected your own positioning on open source licensing? I know you have made some changes. Perhaps you could just help people get a level set playing field. And then I'd love to get into kind of the technology itself. But I think this is an important conversation, and your context in it is very, very critical.
Yeah, so I'm going to talk about Redis. So the core of Redis is on the BSD license. And BSD says you can use it, change it, modify it. You don't have to give those changes back. And so the core is BSD. It will always be BSD. Around that, we've got the extensibility of Redis. So we call those modules. And so we've got a great case here of Rajat is using all sorts of modules to actually extend how they use Redis. So we have things like search and graph and time series, right? As a company, we release those in a source available license. because we need to ensure there's certain restrictions around how those get deployed. For example, can a cloud service provider deploy those? They can't without having a particular agreement in place with us. So we've had to do some things in order to protect the IP that we're creating, not so that it's a barrier for companies building things with it, but those companies that are then monetizing the deployment of those things. And so I think that's the sea change you've seen from us and Elastic and MongoDB and a number of the companies in this space, because we have to ensure that we can sustain the longevity of the project by ensuring that we can all generate cash from that to do that.
What is your main concern?
Main concern is ensuring the longevity of the project. Right? The longevity of the project means that you've got to have viable companies around that, and those companies have got to be able to generate cash in order to create those projects. And so I think that's the sort of the natural give and take of open source companies.
So this is a good segue, I think, into Rajab, maybe talking about how you're using modules from Redis. And I'd love to hear a little bit about your company and your background in working in databases and how they're evolving in the context of modules and your adoption of them.
Sure. So I myself working as a chief technology officer, with Holidayme. So that's an online travel agency, and so it's a bit more than 13 years of experience which I'm having, right? And during these years, mostly all NoSQL database is something that I have worked upon. So I have worked upon like MongoDB, DynamoDB, Redis. So these have been the major focus for in terms of the databases which I have worked upon. Now, so I can see a drastic change in past 3 years itself, like exactly how the complete shift is moving across, and more towards NoSQL databases, right? So there's always a debate which comes across from a SQL or NoSQL, but practically there's a very fine difference that you need to identify exactly which database that you need to go ahead. But recently, the NoSQL database in itself, it has become so popular because past 4 years, 5 years has been the kind of years which has been for all the startups. Like there are too many startups which are growing. And whenever you have startups, you have to grow at very fine pace, and which means that you have to have more and more changes doing quickly. You cannot go back to SQL and redesigning the schema again and again. So NoSQL databases, they give you this kind of flexibility that today you want to have this feature, fine, you add few columns across and you are up and running. So that is a very best, I would say, a use case as well as push, which is driving more towards NoSQL databases, right? But again, that doesn't mean that SQL databases, they don't have their own position as such, right? And so we have been using Redis for almost 7 years, and so earlier we were using Elastic Cache, and it was working fine for us, right? So. But recently, there were quite a few functionalities that we had created in-house, which were working on top of Redis. So I'll give you a classic example that we wanted to have a autocomplete running, right? And we tried multiple databases, and somehow that autocomplete was not able to give the kind of latency that we were looking for. So what we did, we created autocomplete on Redis, creating the kind of tree structure. So there was a very nice article written by Redis. So we did that. But over the years, we identified that it was still, even though it was very performant, and we were able to have like just response from Redis within 2 milliseconds for the autocomplete altogether. But it was getting a bit more hard to manage. Then recently we got to know about, last year we got to know about the different modules which are there. So Redis Search is there and Redis Graph is there. So Redis Search was something which intrigued us more, and it started opening much different avenues for us in terms of exactly how we can try and test those. And it was at that instant, it was kind of, I would say, hard to believe that we were having a functionality of querying in Redis, because practically Redis has different data types and it's a key value in a nutshell. But Redis search was something which intrigued us more, and that was the I would say the instinct when we decided in terms of going with the Redis Enterprise, and we started exploring that, and we were able to migrate our complete, I would say, the in-house autocomplete thing that we had created, which we used to manage, and we took that completely to Redis search. And honestly, it didn't took us more than 2 days in terms of having the complete transformation, and it was up and running, and it is giving the best latency that we require.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah,
2 days. For those of us who are watching, listening, who aren't completely familiar with NoSQL, how would you define that? I mean, definitions change sometimes. And what is your role in it now?
Well, I'll give you an example from my own career. So in the 2008 timeframe, I was building an online travel agency.
Oh,
No way.
And we were using Oracle and Sun hardware.
Okay.
And so in order to keep up with the performance requirements, essentially we turned Oracle into an XML key value store. We had to take out the joins, we had to denormalize, because it's the only way we could keep up with the data volume rates. And, because you've been on this sort of 10, 15, 20-year relational journey, you go, well, this makes sense. This is how we solve it. And it's until you take a step back and go, what on earth are we doing? We created this complete Frankenstein. We've removed the ability for the business analyst to do any query on it because it's this XML blob which they can't introspect. And for me, my journey intersected with, 2009, meeting the founders of MongoDB, and thinking about the world in documents. And you also had the beginnings of cloud computing, and you go, okay, well, I can't grow my servers any taller. HP Superdome was the biggest thing. There was no bigger computers than that, right? So we want to do horizontal, right? How do you scale out relational databases horizontally? Well, it's real problematic because you end up having to join across all of your servers. And so the notion of NoSQL goes, okay, we're going to use different data models to represent differently so that we can distribute the data. There's going to be some compromises in that, which means that you lose some of the flexibility that SQL gave you, but you get the horizontal scalability, and you get these other things that, for example, one of the things that people love about NoSQL is the flexibility of schema. It's easy for each piece of data to look different, but it's also the fact that developers see data structures that are familiar to them. So they get lists, sets, sorted sets, they get JSON documents, and this is their mental model. In the relational world, you had this database schema that DBAs did, and then you had your Java code or your C# code, and these two things look completely different. So you had this mapping layer to do this constant transformation, and that's just, it's really alien for a developer to go, look, I've got this Java object and it materializes into 10 tables. I have no idea what that means. And so I think there's this intersection of being enabled developers to be much more in control of their world, cloud computing and distributed computing, and people just dealing with a lot more data than they've ever done, orders of magnitude more data.
Yeah.
So there's one more thing which I'll add to this, and I guess everybody will be able to relate to it. So whenever project comes across and there is we have to create a database, right? So if we go with a SQL, so people, they spend a lot of time that we have to make it normalized. They'll do third normalization, they'll create a fancy, good-looking table altogether. Over the time period when things, the requirements, they start coming in, then they keep on denormalizing that table because they have to be more performant, right? So that's the whole thing. Initially, you are spending more time in terms of making it much more normalized so that it looks good, right? And because you have to do what you have been taught in college, right? Then you start denormalizing it because you have to have more performant. So NoSQL is something which is definitely solving this gap altogether. And that is me honestly, I'm very pro NoSQL kind of guy.
And for those who want to merge and make hybridizations of different database types, how does that work?
Well, I think that's the world we live in, right? So we lived in a world where you picked one relational database and, the vendors would say, put all your data into the relational database. I think the world now is very much bifurcated. right? What developers are doing is choosing the right tool for the job. Sometimes it's going to be Redis, sometimes it's going to be a SQL database, sometimes it's going to be something else.
Right.
And so we're going to live in this polyglot. Now, how each company deals with their polyglot is going to be a really interesting problem to solve, because now you want to query across domains. How do you do that? And I think your story about dealing with that and microservices is really part of the story about how you deal with this.
Yeah. So just coming to that as well, I think in terms of which database to choose, or whenever there's new database coming into the market, right? So there's always a human emotion tendency which comes across. That is a fear. I'll give our classic example. 6 years back when we were using Redis, right? So Redis or Memcache, practically it's a memory store, right? So you are saving all the data just in the RAM, and in case your system restarts, you have lost your data, right? So that was the kind of perception that we had. So back then, what we used to do, we had all our data into persistent storage, which was either SQL or NoSQL, and we used to make a copy in Redis so that we can serve the queries much faster to the customer. But in case, if the server restarts, I can repopulate that data across, right? And I would say, even at that instant, it was a kind of fear that our data shouldn't get lost, right? Over the past 6 years, I would do touch wood, but we did have an instance where our data was lost. So practically, there are few scenarios where our main data is stored in Redis only, right? So we don't have any SQL or MongoDB or MySQL. So everything is stored in Redis, and it's working fine.
I mean, for us, I think that's been one of the interesting observations for how people use Redis. Right? People would traditionally seen it as a replacement for Memcached as a cache.
Yeah.
Right? I'm here trying to accelerate some slower storage behind me, whether it's a relational database or MongoDB or whatever. But what we've seen, and you're a great example of this, is people saying, look, I'm using Redis as my primary database. Yeah, the data only exists in Redis. And as a company, we've been investing in those enterprise features to make that possible. Whether that's persistence, whether that is memory tiering over DRAM and persistent memory or SSD, whether that's active-active for doing geo-replication. A lot of these features ensure that people can be more successful faster with Redis and therefore with NoSQL.
So I have a question then. I know that you have announced this capability really to offer this Redis Insight.
Yep.
And that's a developer administrative tool really to visually manipulate and manage data with any Redis deployment.
Yep.
And a big part of this is also going back to microservices, a topic that really relates to Kubernetes and how you've adopted Kubernetes as an operator. Perhaps you could tell us a little bit about what is the reasoning for this shift and the need to provide this capability to manipulate and manage the data differently, and how does Kubernetes fit into this story?
Well, great question. So, I'm a command line guy. I like typing things in. And the way I look at data in Redis is through the CLI. But I'm an outlier. Most sort of enterprise developers sit in front of their Windows PC. They want some way to visually navigate the data, to inspect the data, to look at performance, to be able to visualize graphs or streams on their desktop. And so Redis Insight is a tool that we launched in October. It came through an acquisition. What we've been doing is enhancing it with support for modules and a whole bunch of other things, but it's a way for anybody to look at that data inside Redis or Redis Enterprise so that you get that intimacy. You can understand the performance characteristics and so on and so forth. Now, Kubernetes, on the other hand, we're starting to see a huge amount of usage of Kubernetes with Redis Enterprise.
How do you measure that?
Just the number of customers who are now using that as the deployment strategy.
Can you quantify that for us at all?
So I would say it's still early days, but I would say in the last 6 months we've seen orders of magnitude more customers. When we say, how are you going to deploy, it used to be about 50-50 on-prem or cloud. They want to manage service or they're going to do it on-prem. Now when you say on-prem, they're going, well, actually what we want to do is we want to take either your Kubernetes operator or the PKS operator or one of the other Kubernetes distributions, and we want to take your Redis Enterprise and deploy it into our environment using Kubernetes. And so one of the things that we announced in October was also auto recovery. So one of the challenges with any distributed system is that things are going to fail. And things are going to fail probably more often if you deploy them into the cloud. And so what we did with auto recovery is to ensure that if you lose part of the infrastructure or all of the infrastructure, you can actually recover it and actually get it back to its consistent state automatically. And so again, this alleviates the burden of the operator, right? And so if you still want to manage, because you don't want to go to a fully managed service, Kubernetes is a way to dramatically reduce the day-to-day operational burden for your DevOps teams.
Have you experienced that as well?
So for us, it's completely Lambda, right? So we never required Kubernetes altogether or any other Docker framework.
It's completely what?
It's on Lambda.
Yeah, okay.
So practically and even we didn't require in terms of Docker kind of thing. Like either we were using Elastic Cache earlier, and now we are using a Redis Enterprise. So we ourselves don't want to manage anything, right? So that's why Kubernetes is something that we haven't worked upon. We don't require altogether.
Okay.
Yeah. So coming back to your question, I missed that question in terms of our journey for microservices and the role of Redis in that, right? So the thing is about 2 years back, our complete infrastructure, so it was completely monolithic, right? And we definitely wanted to move towards microservices along with serverless, having both working together. Another point which we had was logs is something which play a very important role. So earlier, our complete backend that was on EC2 instances, right? And it's much easier to attain logs once you have a control of EC2 instance or the environment where it is. So for example, if you can have a daemon service or a Windows service running in the background, and your application can keep on pushing those logs across to that service. And since it's a local machine, you don't have any latency altogether. And that service can send those logs across whenever it is required to the backend. So practically, whenever you are generating logs, it is not penalizing your customer in terms of that the additional latency that it may incur for the logs. Now, once we started moving to Lambda, now the question which was we started realizing at least 80 to 90 milliseconds it was taking additionally in terms of returning the report, because it had to send those logs across to whatever the backend that we required. So there were quite a few services that we looked at, but honestly none of those worked. And then an idea came across, why not push the log across to Redis list, right? And it was just a thought. We implemented our own driver where we created our own logging framework where any log, it was getting directly pushed to Redis. And we were able to achieve that under 10 milliseconds, right? So practically, it becomes much more it's not easy to think using Redis for logs, but Redis was the best broker that we had in terms of the lowest latency and pushing that logs across to Redis. And then we had additional backend, which is pulling those logs across and saving that to database. So this was a key area. Otherwise, all our executions, they would have at least 110 milliseconds more just to push that log.
Interesting. So
that was a pretty thing.
So by using Redis Enterprise for that, you could maintain the commitment to your customer in terms of response, but deal with the ever-changing architecture in the background.
Yes.
Right. And that's a very common story that we see Redis deployed, which is, the contract externally, whether you're bidding on a Google AdWord or you're doing a credit score for credit card processing or a recommendation or personalization on a website, you want to maintain that contract regardless of what the back-end architecture and the services and the databases are. And this is where, typically people start with Redis. They cache that data that's critical to get out to the consumer, and that's the point of engagement to surface the data.
Is it possible to maybe quantify or characterize the infrastructures you're dealing with now? How has that changed? For example, you're talking about on-premises versus bare metal.
We're going to soon have servers with thousands of cores in, right? We've now got new memory technologies like Intel's persistent memory. You've got SSD. You've got DRAM. DRAM's getting really cheap. You can get a terabyte of DRAM for $15,000.
Even cheaper.
Right. And so I think that the compute infrastructure is dramatically changing. That, what you do with thousands of cores now, what you do with the ability to address petabytes of data in almost zero latency. And I think as a database provider, that kind of changes how you have to architect your product. But for people like yourself, it just opens up a whole new world of things that you can do that were just not plausible 5-10 years ago, or were plausible but would have been so crazy expensive you just wouldn't have done. But how many details about you and your life can you put in a terabyte of memory? An awful lot. That means that somebody can do something much more sophisticated, much more personalized to your needs. So rather than giving you the generic list of next products, you can go, oh, how about this thing? And you suddenly go, how does it know me so well, right? You need data, you need processing, you need very low latency to give those sort of delightful moments.
So what opportunities is this opening for you? Can you contextual what else?
Opportunity in terms of
well, now infrastructure is changing quite a bit as the number of cores is increasing, the cost of DRAM is going down.
So the way I see it is, for me, it doesn't matter. So for instance, let's say I'm not in the business of managing the infrastructure and all, right? So my responsibility is giving service to my customers.
But that always changes the software. What you can do with the software.
So that's the benefit of using a cloud provider, because all the heavy lifting, everything, so that is taken care by the cloud provider. So in case new cores are coming in, or the kind of performance that they have agreed upon in terms of giving that performance to you, it's completely their responsibility. I'm only cared about is I should be getting under 1 millisecond response from the database. That's
exactly.
Yeah.
So, but what it does do is it lowers the barrier to risk, doesn't it? Now, we've seen this with container adoption, right?
Yeah.
As containers became more, popular, people were realizing, well, there's actually less risk in using containers because I can experiment more, because if it fails, it doesn't really matter, right?
Yeah.
So what is that, how does that change your use cases that you are exploring, for example?
So specifically, again, in our use case, whenever we see using any service, either it's a database as a service or any infrastructure as a service. So only thing which matters is we don't want to have our own people managing that infrastructure or anything, right? So we require that this is the kind of service that we need, or this is the kind of functionality that we want to have. So that is out of the box. How it is working, more cores getting added, any kind of patching being done. So that is completely I don't want to know about it.
Right. So as a service provider, what this allows us to do is provide to our customers the ability to do multi-tenancy, to get more out of those servers on the back end, so we get better utilization. And what that means to them is better cost of service. Right?
It's the cost matter then, in some respects.
Yes.
Right.
Is it a matter of better software development, or of more sophisticated services you can offer, or both?
Both. Because, so for example, a classic use case is let's say today I'm having a traffic of, let's say, X million coming onto my website, right? So why would I need to know that there are X number of servers which are running, and in terms of getting 10x growth, I need to have 10x servers, because everything is getting managed by themselves. they are adding up in terms of the databases, whatever the cores that you have. So that is something which makes much more sense altogether, and I can do my business, right? Not manage an infrastructure.
So what are you hearing on the streets? What's going on? You know, the streets of Las Vegas.
You know, there have been a lot of announcements at the conference today in the keynote, and I think we're at a sort of really interesting cusp where, you know, the cloud is real. You know, the Fortune 500 or the Global 8,000, depending on what your metric is, seeing this as a real alternative to how they've done business. I think it's, you know, some are going to move fast, some are going to move slow, and it's a question of how they can piece together these services to change how they retool their own businesses. And so we love to talk about technology. I think the really interesting thing that's going to happen is how do we retool all the humans to be effective in these new environments where there aren't machines, there aren't data centers, they've got these services that they have to incorporate, they have to adhere to the compliance and regulatory needs of their industries. And I think it's much more of a retooling of people as it is another great service announcement of this new thing you can do. And I think that's going to be the fascinating theme for the next 5-10 years. How do we take this big body of people who've been trained to work and live and operate in one way and sort of completely retool them in order to work in a way that they've got access to vast amounts of data? How are they going to do that in an ethically and responsible way and with the right governance? And so I think this is as much of a people tooling age as it's going to be these great things that you can do with the ubiquity of all the resources you've got in the cloud.
Because you have the large organizations as well, and they're on their learning curves.
Yep.
And at the same time, you have the startups, but they have their learning curves, deciding which database configuration they want to use. And we're at that exciting conjecture as well, where you have Amazon made some interesting announcements today about what they're offering as far as databases go. And I was wondering what you thought that could lead to or create in terms of
I'm curious on your
environment.
on their commitment to Cassandra in particular.
For example.
I mean, I think this is the beauty of open source. You've got the opportunity to go create these new products, these new services. You know, Amazon's announcement of Cassandra as a service, I think is really interesting. If Cassandra is something that you utilize for solving the problems, like we said earlier, I think honestly, every organization is going to end up with this big toolbox. You know, 20 years ago they were choosing Oracle, Sybase, DB2 or Informix. They wouldn't choose two of them. Typically they would choose one. They would standardize. Now we're in a world where people are going to end up with 10, 15 tools. Then once they pick the tool, they've now got 4 or 5 different deployment options. They can run it themselves. They can use a service provided by Amazon or Azure or GCP. And I think we're creating this great opportunity for a lot of IT people to have a lot of complexity they've now got to figure through on how they choose these things. And so I think in terms of choice as a consumer, it's a beautiful day of some of the things that Amazon announced because there's now more choice. I think for those people making the choices, it's really difficult for them to now work through that.
So streets, they are filled with excitement and knowledge, and specifically like these are 2 days, like Andy Jassy and 1 of August, like whenever they come in and in terms of whatever the new announcements which comes across. So that's the day like you can actually see people or all the attendees discussing about those announcements, exactly how they can use those kind of things. So just to answer your question, yes, the streets, they are filled with excitement and knowledge, and that is even I'm pretty excited in terms of all the announcements that we had, specifically in terms of all the AI ML stuff and as well as the Cassandra. So let's see exactly how.
Yeah, but how many tools do you really need? How many hammers do you need?
So there's a very good human tendency, like
One more, right?
Yes. So even though you may not need it, but just having a thought that you have everything, that keeps you much more motivated as well as peace of mind.
What do you mean by having everything?
So for instance, let's say if I give you an option, like out of these 5 databases, you can have only option of 3 databases. Even though the rest 2 databases you might not use, but you will think, why am I not having those 2 databases? So practically, you have the peace of mind that you can have everything. In case in future you need that, you will be able to use it. So that is the biggest peace of mind. Like that's a human
flexibility.
Exactly.
Makes for quite a shop.
Sorry?
Makes for quite a tool shop.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's a bit like going into a candy store and seeing all these rows of candy and going, I want one of everything. But reality, there are particular candies that you've grown up with or you've learned to love, and you're going to go to those. You know, for me as a kid, it was cola cubes and pear drops, which won't mean anything to any American. But to
What was a pear drop?
Pear drop, these like hard-boiled sweets, which are awesome.
Wow.
And to British people, it'd be very nostalgic.
Were they tangy?
They were tangy, yeah. They were like sort of fruit flavored.
Yeah.
But
Do they come in tins?
You used to get them in these big jars,
Okay.
and you get like a quarter of a pound, you know, for 20p, and it's like a most amazing thing. But you know, Americans grew up with all sorts of candies I didn't grow up, and so the same's going to be with database tools, right? We grew up with a whole bunch of things. We're going to discover some new things we want to try, and there's going to be people coming in that your journey started with no SQL. You didn't really do the SQL thing,
Exactly.
and I think you're probably one of the first people I've met of that generation. I think that's fascinating.
Yeah, that is fascinating. Yeah, we were saying that at the beginning that you never knew SQL really. You just used NoSQL.
Yeah.
Yeah. So any last question, Bruce, before we go?
Yeah, but it would take like 3 hours to answer.
Well, good. Well, thank you both for taking the time to talk with us today. It's been a lot of fun. I've been joined by Alvin Richards. He's Chief Product Officer at Redis Labs. Rajat Panwar, CTO at Holidayme. And we covered a lot of ground here. We talked about open source and the state of open source. We talked about the modules capabilities and the reasons for really that new graphical user interface you've been developing, and Kubernetes and microservices. I would love to follow up another time and hear more about Lambda and how you're using Lambda. So there's lots we covered and lots to discuss even more. So thank you for your time.
Thanks for the invite. It's been fun.
Thank you.
Modern businesses depend on the power of real-time data. With Redis Labs, organizations deliver instant experiences in a highly reliable and scalable manner. Redis Labs is the home of Redis, the world's most popular in-memory database and commercial provider of Redis Enterprise. Listen to more episodes of the New Stack Makers at thenewstack.io/podcasts. Please rate and review us on iTunes, like us on YouTube, and follow us on SoundCloud. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.